Okay, so you know how we've been talking about this whole oceanic feeling thing, like that feeling of being totally connected to the universe?
Right. Where you lose your sense of self and just kind of merge with everything.
Exactly. It's wild, right? And we got those excerpts you sent in, the ones about Sigmund Freud's ideas about it.
Yeah, it really is a fascinating concept.
It's a total rabbit hole, but a really interesting one. So I guess the first thing is like, what is this feeling, really? How would you even describe it?
Hmm. Well, it's definitely one of those things that's easier to feel than to put into words.
Right. Like, how do you explain that feeling of just dissolving into something bigger than yourself?
Yeah, but I guess at its core, it's this profound sense of unity. Like all those boundaries between you and the world around you just disappear.
People often link it to spirituality too, right? Like a mystical experience or something.
Definitely. It's often described as incredibly peaceful, even transcendent. Like you're tapping into something much larger than yourself, something beyond the everyday.
Okay, so that makes sense. But then you've got Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, and you'd think he'd be all about the spiritual side of things. But it sounds like that wasn't quite his take.
Yeah, you're right. He was a bit more grounded in his approach, let's say.
More like down to earth.
Exactly. He didn't completely dismiss the oceanic feeling. He acknowledged it was a real experience.
Oh, okay, so he wasn't just like, nope, that's all nonsense.
No, not at all. But he approached it from a psychological perspective rather than a mystical or spiritual one.
So was he basically saying we're all just trying to get back to that blissed out state of being a baby?
Well, it's not that simple.
Yeah.
But Freud did theorize that the oceanic feeling might be connected to our earliest experiences.
Because the babies don't have a solid sense of self yet, right?
Exactly. They don't see themselves as separate from their surroundings. It's all one big, interconnected blur for them.
So in a way, it's like we're trying to return to that primal unity we experienced as infants.
It's one way to think about it. But as we grow up, we develop our ego, our sense of individuality, and that creates those boundaries between us and the world.
Right, like this is me and that's you and all that.
Exactly. The ego helps us navigate the world, but it also creates separation.
So maybe the oceanic feeling is like hitting the pause button on our ego for a little while.
You could say that it's like those boundaries dissolve and we experience a temporary merging with something larger.
So does that mean it's just a kind of regression then? Like we're escaping back to a simpler time?
Freud considered that possibility for sure.
Like we're overwhelmed by all the complexities of being an adult, so we seek refuge in this feeling of oneness.
Yeah, it could be a way of retreating from those anxieties, a sort of mental vacation from all the pressures of being a separate self.
Okay, that makes sense. But the excerpts you sent also mentioned Freud thought other psychological factors might be at play, like all those hidden desires and anxieties we carry around.
Right. It wasn't just about childhood experiences for him. He saw the oceanic feeling as potentially connected to our unconscious mind. You know, all that stuff bubbling beneath the surface.
Yeah, like those deep-seated fears and desires we don't even realize we have.
Exactly. So by dissolving those ego boundaries, even for a little while, we might find temporary relief from those inner conflicts.
So it's like all that tension and turmoil just kind of fades away as we experience this sense of unity.
It's one way to think about it.
Okay, so we've got baby bliss, ego dissolution, and an escape from inner turmoil. But what about the spiritual aspect of this whole thing?
Right, because people often describe the oceanic feeling as profoundly spiritual, even religious.
Exactly, like they've touched something divine or connected to a higher power.
And that's where Freud's concept of the superego comes in.
The superego, remind me, what was that again?
It's that part of us that strives for perfection, for moral ideals, for higher values, like our inner Boy Scout, always trying to do the right thing.
Oh, right, right. So how does that tie into the oceanic feeling?
Well, Freud suggested that this feeling, with its sense of transcendence and connection to something bigger, could be linked to the superego's longing for something beyond the everyday world.
So it's like tapping into our desire for meaning and purpose, that yearning for something greater than ourselves.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And that's where things get really interesting, because even with all these psychological explanations, Freud wasn't convinced that the oceanic feeling actually proved the existence of a higher power or universal soul.
Wait, really? So he was saying, okay, the feeling is real, the experience is valid, but I'm not jumping on the mystical bandwagon just yet.
Yeah, he was more interested in understanding the mind than in answering those big metaphysical questions. He was a materialist, someone who believed that everything, even our thoughts and feelings, ultimately comes down to physical matter.
I see. So for Freud, it was all about the mechanics of the mind, not about proving or disproving the existence of God or a universal soul.
Right. He focused on how these experiences happen within the brain, not on their ultimate meaning or significance.
Okay, but that doesn't mean his view is the end-all be-all, right?
Not at all. It's just one perspective.
Yeah.
And if we step outside of Freudian psychology, we find all sorts of other traditions and ways of thinking about this, ones that might offer different interpretations.
Like what kind of traditions? I'm curious. What else is out there?
Well, for starters, you have many Eastern traditions that emphasize the interconnectedness of all things,
What?
like Buddhism or Hinduism.
Right. Those traditions talk a lot about oneness and unity and stuff, right?
Exactly. And they have practices like meditation and yoga that are designed to quiet the ego and cultivate a sense of merging with something larger.
So they're actually trying to induce this oceanic feeling.
You could say that. They see it not as a regression, but as a glimpse into the true nature of reality.
Interesting. So it's not about going back to infancy, but about accessing a deeper level of awareness.
Right. And it's not limited to Eastern traditions either. Within Christianity, for instance, there are mystical branches where individuals describe experiences that sound very similar to the oceanic feeling. They talk about merging with God, about experiencing divine union.
So it's like this theme of dissolving boundaries and experiencing unity shows up across different cultures and religions.
Exactly. And it's not just limited to formal religious or spiritual traditions either. Think about all the artists and writers who have explored this theme.
You mean like poets who talk about feeling connected to nature, or musicians who create music that evokes a sense of transcendence?
Yeah. There are countless examples throughout history of artists tapping into this idea of oneness, of merging with something larger than themselves.
It's like this deep human longing to connect, to belong to something greater than ourselves, keeps popping up no matter where you look.
It really does seem to be a universal human impulse. And what's especially fascinating is that modern science is starting to take a closer look at these kinds of experiences.
Really, science is getting in on this whole oceanic feeling thing. Tell me more about that.
Well, fields like neuroscience and transpersonal psychology are now exploring altered states of consciousness.
Like those states where your perception of reality shifts.
Exactly. And they're finding that experiences induced by things like meditation or even psychedelics often share striking similarities with the oceanic feeling.
Interesting. So they're using science to try and understand those states of consciousness where people report feeling that sense of unity and transcendence.
Exactly. And they're finding some pretty amazing things.
Okay, spill the beans. What are they finding?
Well, for one thing, they're using brain imaging technology to see what's happening in the brain during these experiences. And they're discovering that certain areas of the brain, particularly those associated with our sense of self, actually show decreased activity.
So it's like those parts of the brain that define our ego or individuality, they just kind of chill out.
Yeah, you could say that. It's like a neurological unplugging from the ego, which might explain why people feel that sense of merging with something larger.
Wow, that's incredible. So science is actually starting to provide evidence for what mystics and spiritual folks have been saying for ages.
It is, and it's not just about meditation or psychedelics either. They've found similar brain activity patterns during intense spiritual experiences, moments of awe in nature, even during deep connection with another person.
So it's like all these experiences that evoke a sense of unity, of dissolving boundaries, they seem to share a common neurological basis.
It seems that way, and that's a pretty profound insight. It suggests that these experiences aren't just figments of our imagination, they're real, measurable phenomena happening in our brains.
So we're not just making this stuff up.
Exactly.
This is all so fascinating. It's like science is offering a whole new way of understanding these experiences that have long been described in spiritual or mystical terms.
I know, it's pretty mind-blowing. And this dialogue between science and spirituality is so valuable. It allows us to approach these profound experiences from multiple angles.
Okay, so if the oceanic feeling has this neurological basis, does that mean we can, like, learn to cultivate it intentionally? Can we actually train our brains to access this state more easily?
That's a great question, and it's something many researchers are exploring right now. And there's growing evidence that practices like mindfulness meditation can actually change the structure and function of our brains over time.
Really? Like physically change our brains?
It seems so. And those changes often lead to increased activity in areas associated with compassion, empathy, and self-awareness.
And those are all qualities that seem pretty conducive to experiencing the oceanic feeling, right? Less ego, more connection, more compassion.
Exactly. And that's why some researchers believe that by cultivating these qualities, maybe through practices like meditation, we might be able to create conditions that make the oceanic feeling more accessible.
So it's not just about having this random, fleeting experience. It's about the potential for lasting changes in how we experience the world and relate to others.
Precisely. And those changes could have a ripple effect, influencing not only our personal well-being, but also how we interact with each other and with the planet as a whole.
Wow, that's a powerful thought. It's not just a cool feeling, it's a potential pathway to a more compassionate and connected way of being.
Absolutely. And that brings us to a key point. The oceanic feeling, whether it happens spontaneously or is cultivated intentionally, can be a catalyst for deep personal growth and transformation.
It's more than just a psychological or neurological phenomenon. It's something that can potentially change how we live our lives.
It's about shifting our perspective and realizing that we're not just isolated individuals. We're part of something much, much larger.
Okay, I'm definitely feeling that sense of awe and wonder right now. But I also remember you mentioning some potential downsides or challenges to watch out for when it comes to this whole oceanic feeling thing. I'd love to hear more about that when we come back.
Definitely. We need to explore the potential pitfalls too, because like with anything powerful, there's always the possibility for misuse or misunderstanding.
Right, it's not all sunshine and cosmic rainbows. There's a shadow side to consider. We'll be back soon to dive into that. Okay, so we're back and ready to explore those potential downsides you mentioned. Like, I get that the oceanic feeling can be powerful, but it can't all be blissful unity and cosmic rainbows, right?
Yeah, you're right. It's like anything else. You've got to approach it with a balanced perspective. There can be downsides if we're not careful.
So what are some of the things we should be aware of? Like, what are the potential red flags?
Well, one concern is that, chasing after this feeling could turn into a form of escapism.
Oh, I can see that. The world can feel pretty overwhelming sometimes. It'd be tempting to just, escape into that state of blissful oneness.
Exactly. And it's tempting to just stay there, too. But we all know that real growth comes from facing challenges head on, not avoiding them.
Yeah, ignorance is bliss and all that. But sometimes you've just got to deal with the tough stuff.
Exactly. So while those moments of respite, those moments of transcendence can be super valuable, they shouldn't become a substitute for actually living your life.
Right. So it's all about balance, like integrating those experiences into your life without losing sight of your responsibilities.
Precisely. It's about finding that sweet spot, drawing inspiration from the oceanic feeling without using it as an excuse to just check out.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's more like using the feeling to fuel your engagement with the world, not to avoid it.
Exactly. And another potential challenge, this one's maybe a bit more subtle, is the risk of misinterpreting the whole thing.
In what way?
Well, we talked about how the oceanic feeling can be profoundly spiritual or religious for some, but what happens if those interpretations become, super rigid?
Oh, I see what you mean. Like you have this experience and then you start thinking you have all the answers.
Right, or that you're somehow better than others who haven't had the same experience.
Yeah, like I've seen the light and you haven't.
Exactly. But it's important to remember that this is still a subjective experience, and how we interpret it is going to be colored by our own beliefs and background.
So humility is important here, like recognizing that our understanding might not be the be-all and end-all.
Absolutely. Humility is key.
Mm.
And also being open to other perspectives. Because, dogmatism and rigidity can really stifle genuine exploration.
Yeah, that makes sense. You don't want to get stuck in just one interpretation.
Right. And, another thing to consider is that pursuing this feeling could actually become an unhealthy obsession.
Like you get so fixated on achieving that state that it takes over your life.
Exactly. We live in a culture that tends to romanticize these peak experiences. But the truth is, that kind of grasping can actually make the experience more elusive.
So it's more about surrendering to the experience, letting go of control.
Exactly. It's a paradox. But the harder you try to force it, the further away it seems to get.
It's like trying to capture a butterfly. You create the right conditions, but you can't force it to land on your hand.
Perfect analogy. You cultivate the ground, but you can't control how the seed sprouts.
Okay, I'm digging this. So we've talked about the potential pitfalls, but I want to circle back to something we discussed earlier, the science behind all of this. Like, what are researchers actually finding when they study those altered states of consciousness that, kind of mirror the oceanic feeling?
Yeah. This is where things get really exciting. One of the big areas of focus is the study of the brain during meditative states and psychedelic experiences. Both of those things can sometimes induce feelings similar to the oceanic feeling.
Right, that sense of unity and blurred boundaries like we were talking about before.
Exactly. And researchers are using brain imaging technology to see what's actually happening at the neural level during these experiences.
So they can like literally see what's going on in the brain when someone is feeling that sense of oneness.
Yep. And one of the most interesting findings is that certain areas of the brain, particularly those associated with our sense of self, show decreased activity during these experiences.
Wait, so when we're feeling connected to everything, those parts of the brain are actually less active?
It seems that way. One example is the default mode network. It's usually active when we're thinking about ourselves, lost in our thoughts and feelings. But during these experiences, it tends to quiet down.
So it's like a neurological unplugging from the ego. Fascinating.
It is. And it's not just limited to meditation or psychedelics. They've seen similar patterns during intense spiritual experiences, moments of awe in nature, even deep connection with another person.
So it's like all these different experiences that evoke that sense of unity and transcendence, they all seem to involve a similar shift in brain activity.
That's what the research suggests. And it's a pretty big deal because it means these experiences aren't just some woo-woo fantasy. They have a real, measurable basis in the brain.
Science is backing up what the mystics have been saying all along. It's pretty wild.
I know, right? It's like science is giving us a new language for understanding these experiences that we've traditionally described in more spiritual or mystical terms.
It's a pretty cool bridge between those two worlds.
Totally. And this conversation between science and spirituality is so valuable because it helps us approach these profound experiences from multiple angles.
Okay, so if the oceanic feeling has this basis in the brain, does that mean we can actually train ourselves to access it more readily? Like, can we learn to cultivate it?
That's the million-dollar question. And it's something that researchers are definitely looking into. There's growing evidence that practices like mindfulness meditation can actually change the structure and function of our brains over time.
Like literally rewire our brains.
In a way, yes. And those changes often lead to more activity in the areas associated with things like compassion and empathy and self-awareness.
And those qualities all seem like they would support the oceanic feeling, right? Like dissolving the ego, connecting with something larger, feeling more compassion. It all seems to fit.
Exactly. And that's why some researchers think that maybe by cultivating these qualities, we can create the conditions that make it easier to experience the oceanic feeling.
So it's not just about having a cool experience, it's about the potential for real change.
Exactly. And those changes could have a ripple effect, not just on our own well-being, but on how we relate to others and the world around us.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. It's like this feeling could actually help us create a more compassionate and connected world.
Absolutely. And that brings us to a key point. The oceanic feeling, whether we experience it spontaneously or cultivate it through practice, can be a powerful catalyst for personal growth and transformation.
It's more than just a cool feeling. It has the potential to change the way we live our lives.
It's about shifting our perspective, realizing we're part of something much bigger than ourselves. And that can be incredibly empowering.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've explored the science, the potential benefits, and even some of the challenges associated with the oceanic feeling. It's been a wild ride.
It has. But before we wrap up, I think it's important to acknowledge that even with all the research, there's still a lot we don't know about this phenomena.
Yeah, there's still a sense of mystery, right? Like we can study the brain and talk about neurochemicals, but there's something about this experience that goes beyond our current scientific understanding.
Exactly. And that's part of what makes it so fascinating.
So we're left with this sense of awe and wonder and maybe a healthy dose of humility. Like we can explore it, we can try to understand it, but ultimately the oceanic feeling remains this profound mystery, a testament to the vastness of human consciousness.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
Okay, so we're back, and I'm ready to unpack those potential challenges you mentioned, because, let's face it, the idea of experiencing this profound sense of unity is pretty alluring, but it can't all be sunshine and cosmic rainbows, right?
You got it. It's like with anything powerful, there are some downsides if you're not mindful.
So what are some things we should be aware of? Like, what are the red flags to watch out for?
Well, one concern is that chasing after this oceanic feeling, it could turn into a kind of escape.
That makes sense. I mean, the world can be pretty intense, right? It's tempting to just want to escape into that bliss.
Exactly. And it's tempting to just kind of stay there. But, you know, we all know that real growth often comes from actually facing our challenges, not avoiding them.
Yeah, yeah, I hear you. It's like that old saying, ignorance is bliss. But sometimes you got to deal with the tough stuff to really grow.
Right. So those moments of peace, those moments of transcendence, they can be super valuable, but they shouldn't become a substitute for actually living your life and dealing with reality.
So it's all about balance then, like integrating those experiences into your daily life without losing sight of who you are and the challenges you face.
Exactly. It's about finding that sweet spot,
Yeah.
like drawing inspiration from the oceanic feeling, sure, but not using it as an excuse to just check out of reality.
Okay, so it's more like using it to fuel your engagement with the world, not to avoid it.
Exactly. And another thing, this one's a bit more subtle, it's the risk of kind of misinterpreting the experience.
How so?
Well, we were talking about how this feeling can feel spiritual or religious for some people. But what happens if those interpretations get really rigid?
Oh, I see what you mean. It's like you have this amazing experience and suddenly you think you've got all the answers.
Right. Or that you're somehow better than
Yeah.
people who haven't had the same experience.
Yeah, that holier than thou kind of vibe.
Exactly. But it's important to remember that this is still a subjective experience.
Right.
And how we interpret it is going to be shaped by our own beliefs and backgrounds.
So humility is key. Like recognizing that our understanding might not be the whole picture.
Absolutely. Humility is super important. And also, being open to other perspectives. Because that whole dogma thing, rigidity, it can actually block genuine exploration and growth.
Right, right. You don't want to get stuck in just one interpretation.
Exactly. And you know what else? Another thing to think about is that the pursuit of this feeling, well, it could become kind of an obsession.
Like you get so fixated on achieving that state that it kind of takes over your life.
Yeah, exactly. It becomes the only thing that matters. And, we live in a culture that loves those peak experiences. But the truth is, that kind of grasping can make the experience even harder to reach.
So it's more about surrendering, about letting go of control.
Exactly. It's kind of a paradox, but the harder you try to force it, the more elusive it seems to become.
It's like, I don't know, trying to catch a butterfly. You can create the right conditions, the right environment, but you can't force it to land on your hand.
Perfect analogy. You cultivate the garden, but you can't control how the seed grows.
Okay, so we've talked about these potential pitfalls, but I'm kind of curious, can we circle back to the science for a sec? We were talking earlier about, what researchers are finding when they study those altered states of consciousness that seem to like mirror this oceanic feeling.
Yeah, absolutely. That's where things get super exciting. One big area of research is the study of the brain during meditation and psychedelic experiences. Both of those can sometimes create feelings similar to the oceanic feeling.
Right, like that feeling of oneness, those blurred boundaries.
Exactly. And researchers are using this really cool brain imaging technology to actually see what's happening in the brain during these experiences.
So they can see what's going on when someone is feeling that sense of unity.
Yep. And one of the most interesting things they found is that certain areas of the brain, the ones linked to our sense of self, they actually show decreased activity during these experiences.
Wait, so when we're feeling connected to everything, those parts of our brain are actually less active?
It seems that way. Like one example is the default mode network. It's usually really active when we're thinking about ourselves, wrapped up in our own thoughts and feelings. But during these experiences, it tends to quiet down.
So it's like hitting the off switch on the ego.
In a way, yeah. And it's not just meditation or psychedelics either. They've found similar brain activity patterns during intense spiritual experiences, those aha moments out in nature, even when people feel deeply connected to another person.
So all these experiences that evoke this feeling of unity, of transcendence, they all seem to share a common neurological basis.
It seems so. And that's a pretty significant discovery. It suggests that these experiences aren't just like made up. They have a real, measurable biological basis.
Wow. So science is kind of backing up what mystics and spiritual traditions have been saying for ages. It's pretty wild.
Right. It's like science is providing us with a new language, a new way to understand these experiences that we've traditionally talked about in more spiritual or mystical terms.
It's a pretty cool bridge between those two worlds.
Totally. And that conversation between science and spirituality is so valuable. It helps us see these profound experiences from all sides.
Okay, so here's my question. If this feeling has a basis in the brain, does that mean we can train ourselves to experience it more easily?
That's the big question. It's something lots of researchers are exploring right now. And there's more and more evidence that practices like mindfulness meditation, they can actually change the structure and function of our brains over time.
Really, like actually rewire our brains.
That's the idea.
Right.
And those changes, they often lead to more activity in those areas associated with compassion, empathy, and self-awareness.
And those all seem like they'd help with experiencing this feeling, right? Less ego, more connection.
Exactly. And that's
Yeah.
why some researchers think that maybe by cultivating those qualities through practices like meditation, we might be able to prime ourselves to experience the oceanic feeling more readily.
So it's not just about having the experience, it's about like the potential for it to change us.
Exactly. And those changes could have a huge impact, not just on our own well-being, but on how we connect with others and the world around us.
That's amazing. So it's not just a cool feeling, it's like a potential path to a more compassionate and connected way of being.
Totally. And that brings us to a really important point. The oceanic feeling, whether it happens naturally or is something we cultivate, can be a huge catalyst for growth and transformation.
It's like more than just a psychological or neurological thing. It has the potential to really change the way we live.
It shifts our perspective. It helps us realize that we're not just these separate individuals.
Right.
We're a part of something much bigger.
I'm definitely feeling that sense of awe and wonder right now. So I guess this is where we wrap up our deep dive. And honestly, I don't know about you, but I'm feeling a real sense of awe, but also like a healthy dose of caution too.
Hmm.
This is a powerful thing, potentially life-changing, but it's not something to be taken lightly.
Well said.
I hope this deep dive has given everyone listening a better understanding of what this oceanic feeling is all about, and maybe even inspired some folks to explore it a bit in their own lives. Just remember, the journey is just as important as the destination. Whether you experience it directly or just think about its meaning, it invites us to explore the mysteries of consciousness. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.